Some opposition parties, including the African Christian Democratic Party, want a portfolio committee in Parliament to oversee the presidency. They believe this would ensure that there is accountability. Joining us is Professor Swilling, a leadership expert at the Stellenbosch University. Prof, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. What do you think is the significance of opposition parties calling for a portfolio committee to oversee accountability specifically in the presidency?
Well, obviously what underlies it is the gradual accumulation of an enormous number of functions and powers within the presidency, to some extent unprecedented since 1994. And that in turn can be explained by the need to have some form of centralization of power to drive through reforms in the absence of effective implementation at the departmental level.
And is it not enough that there is a committee reporting on the planning, monitoring and evaluation? Do we need another committee to oversee the presidency?
Well, I suppose one option would be to broaden the brief of that particular committee, but the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation has a very specific set of functions, and you need a committee for that. But I think it does make sense to have a committee that reviews the enormous range of functions, commissions, committees, advisory structures, etc., that are concentrated in the presidency. And for some, this is a sign of the centralization of power, which is automatically assumed to be negative. But what we should all hope for is that it's a means for driving through reforms that need to be implemented in practice. And maybe Parliament does need some oversight of how that is happening in the interests of all South Africans.
So, Prof, what role do you believe effective leadership plays in fostering a culture of accountability and transparency within government institutions, particularly at the highest levels of power?
Well, leadership is obviously absolutely critical at all levels, not just at the level of the president, as the kind of formal political leader of the country, but also at ministerial level. And we've lacked leadership at the ministerial level across a number of ministries up until now, not all of them, but significant ones. And we need leadership at the parliamentary level. The parliament up until now has been too passive. It hasn't built the capacity and the necessary oversight at the committee level to really make sure that the executive is fully accountable. So we need a completely new way of thinking about leadership across the board.
So how do you believe then, Prof, that leaders in positions of power navigate opposition calls for increased accountability and oversight while still maintaining the trust and credibility with the public?
Well, I mean, the whole ballgame has changed since we've got the government of national unity in place, because to some extent the opposition is within the government, is within the executive. Especially if you look at the way they've structured ministers and deputy ministers. The deputy ministers could actually become quite a forceful means of accountability of their ministers, especially if they're from another party. So the whole ballgame has shifted, and that in turn is going to have implications for Parliament, because now the official opposition is not on the right of government. It's what many people would regard on the left, although there's some question marks about whether the MKP and EFF are popular. Just because they're populist, does that mean that they're left-wing? But nevertheless, in general, there's a perception that they are to the left of government. And are they going to take their responsibility seriously to make sure that Parliament functions properly, the committees function properly, and the work is done, the documents are read, so that the executive can be held accountable? Or is it just going to be rhetoric and obstructionism? We don't know yet. We still have to see that. But that's their leadership challenge, to make sure Parliament really does work.
Prof, you mentioned having deputy ministers of opposing parties overseeing and ensuring that there's accountability to the ministers that they work hand in hand with. What challenges do you foresee in some of those relationships?
This is completely uncharted territory, so nobody really knows. But just imagine you have a very effective deputy minister from a different party to the minister. And if that deputy minister, and just, by the way, deputy ministers are not in cabinet meetings. Just imagine that deputy minister really does his or her homework properly, reads the documents, formulates opinions, gets technical advice, and starts to ask the minister questions about policy direction. How are, unless they find a way of engaging with each other in a constructive way, the result could be paralysis. Just take, for example, the Minister of Electricity and Energy, Minister Ramakopa, and his deputies from the DA. And the country, and the biggest challenge the country faces is load shedding and the energy crisis. If those two individuals can't get on and see eye to eye and agree on the priorities, we're not going to solve our biggest crisis.
Most certainly. So then what strategies, Prof, can leaders utilize to effectively respond to calls of greater transparency and accountability, particularly when facing scrutiny from opposition parties and other stakeholders?
Well, I think Minister Ramakopa is quite a good example of how you can do that. As you will recall, after he became the Minister of Energy inside the presidency in July 2022, he mounted what was unprecedented in the South African context, which was a weekly press conference, where he was completely transparent with the information and the data about the energy crisis, including visiting all the power stations and coming back and saying they are in trouble, which completely contradicted what Minister Gwede Mantashe had said before that, which was everything's fine, Eskom just needs to switch on the switch, and they're not, because they sabotage, and he accused Doretta of treason. That kind of strategy of obfuscation, of distortion of data, etc., which is what Gwede Mantashe was up to, is not the way to do business. What Ramakopa was doing is the way to do business, to be transparent about the data, to be honest about the problems, and have a clear-cut set of strategies. And that's what we should expect from other ministers. And that's the kind of leadership style that we need. Confident, technically competent, not obfuscating, building bridges, establishing constructive accountability relationships back to Parliament and to the public at large.
All right, Prof, we certainly do hope that with this 7th administration, we'll have more of that accountability and it translating into more services for people on the ground. Thank you for joining us this evening.